There's a lot that's just stimulating my thinking here. And one is, I mean, God, I love the sciences, but I hate scientism. And scientism is all over the place in our culture. I deal with it all the time in my evangelical work, hearing from not just younger people, from everybody in our culture, that science is the criterion. You know, I saw a video, Jonathan, you and Jordan were talking to Brett Weinstein, and it was about, I don't know, maybe it's something along these lines. But he made very articulately, intelligently, but made the argument that the sciences, the physical sciences, belong in the supreme position vis-a-vis all forms of human knowing. And I'm shouting at the screen, no, that's exactly where they don't belong. And that's a form of scientism. The medievals called theology like the queen of the sciences. Well, at least that's more appropriate. You're talking about God and the summum bonum having some kind of supremacy. I also go right back to the classical world. The sciences, from a Platonic standpoint, they're terrific, but you're just getting ever more precise accounts of the cave, right? Of the images, the fleeting, evanescent images of the world. To rise to higher forms of consciousness by way of mathematics, first of all, then to the higher forms of philosophy and metaphysics. Aristotle, moving from physics to mathematics to metaphysics. It's not to denigrate for a second the sciences. Aristotle is the founder in many ways of physics. But it is to say there's a hierarchy again. There's an epistemic hierarchy, and science, physical science, does not belong at the top of it. When it does, something goes really wrong with the human spirit, and there's a starvation of the spirit.
Mm-hmm. Well, and it's hard to know how to take that seriously. Like, let's say that's a fact. There's a starvation of the human spirit. That's a fact. Well, is it a fact like a fact that emerges from physics? Well, not exactly. It's a different kind of fact. But what happens if we ignore it? Well, people suffer and die. And we don't use the fact that in the absence of a proposition, people suffer and die as an index of its truth. Not from a scientific perspective, that isn't the methodology of science. But that leaves us with this problem of meaning. Mm-hmm. It's sort of delivered to us, and it isn't obvious to me that science can address it at all. I mean, Sam Harris and other thinkers like Harris have tried to put the value, to bring the domain of value within the domain of science. I think it's an effort that's doomed to failure because I don't think they're of the same type. I think that science by its very nature it does everything it can to exclude value, except, John, it leaves us with the problem you described, which is the problem that Jung addressed when he was tying the development of empirical science back to alchemy, and this goes back to the idea of the hierarchies that we started out with. Jung believed that he was really curious about why people ever became motivated to take things apart like scientists did, to concentrate on the minute like that. What dream drove them? What fantasies drove them? And for Jung, he found that fantasy in the thousands of years of work on alchemy. And the alchemical notion was there exists a substance, which eventually became a material substance, whose discovery would grant upon its bearer immortality, perfect health, and endless wealth. So the dream was that substance could be found in the material world. And that was a deep, deep unconscious fantasy manifested in all sorts of images, all sorts of bizarre images that Jung had the genius to be able to analyze and understand. And he saw that as the dream that preceded the development of science in Western culture. It took thousands and thousands of years to unfold this dream. And scientists were encapsulated within that dream, whether they knew it or not. And so the prime example would be Newton, who wrote much more on alchemy than he did on physics. And so, John, as scientists, at least from the Jungian perspective, let's say, we're necessarily motivated by a narrative that we don't understand scientifically to engage in the scientific process per se. And we're so deeply possessed by that it guides and moves our perceptions without us as scientists even necessarily having to be aware that we're participating in that narrative. So to your point, the whole enterprise is driven by a dream whose reality can't be encapsulated within the process itself. It's a very strange thing.
I think it's very interesting, that dream and sort of the undercurrents of development. So substance goes back to hypostasis, but of course there's another history of hypostasis, which is into the persons of the Trinity, which is a very different history. And so there's no necessity that you go from hypostasis, the grounding of intelligibility, to materiality. And of course, what happened, right, was also the inversion of matter as pure potential to that which resists and exists. And so, and I think that's part of, again, about how a history of how the reason was supplanted by will as the dominant faculty by which humans understood and identified themselves. I would like to say that that's bound up with a couple other strands. I'm not trying to do, and I wish I could do exhaustive history here, but I took 50 hours to do it, so I'm not going to try and do it now. But you also have, like people like Harris and others, you have a deductivism model, right? Which is I whatever I can deduce from the science is real. But in the Neoplatonic tradition, you also look at what is presupposed by your sciences, and that is also a proper location for the real. So I have to presuppose, right, the intelligibility of the world in order to do science. I can't use science to establish intelligibility. And then if I'm realistic about my science, which I better be, because that's what scientists seem to be doing, I have to be realistic about this intelligibility. But that's in contradiction to the nominalist presuppositions, the flat ontology. Notice the contradiction. Notice the contradiction in reductionism. So you have this whole tradition that says there are no levels of being, get rid of all that Platonic stuff, but the bottom level is the really real level, and all the levels above it are false. That is exactly symmetrical to the upper level is most real, and everything coming down from it is derivative. There's no deep difference. This is part of the point I've made between an emergentist ontology. It is hierarchical and has levels, and an emanationist. It is hierarchical and have levels.
And so do you think Dawkins' selfish gene is an example of that?
I think the idea that you can explain things in a purely bottom-up fashion, this is part of the alchemical revolution. It was like, and I think, and I agree with Jung on this, maybe my interpretation is slightly different, Jordan, but, there was a predominance of, emanation, an emanationist ontology coming out of the Neoplatonic tradition, and we needed to rediscover.
Okay, so let me address that for a second. Drag the Christians in here, because one of the claims that Jung made in his works on alchemy, which are very, very difficult to understand, was that, look, the Christian Revolution took place and spread across what became the Christian cultures and the West, broadly speaking, and there was an offer of salvation, right, of deliverance from suffering, and then and the hope that Christ would return and the kingdom of heaven would be established on earth, or something to that end. And then thousands of years went by, and the disquiet grew as that wasn't revealed, and the unconscious imagination looking to find a source of new knowledge that could redress that suffering and lack started to focus on this opposite emergent ontology that you described. Said we haven't paid sufficient attention to the reality of the material world. Maybe that's what holds the key to the alleviation of our suffering. And so then there's a pull away from the top-down hierarchical structure that Christianity had imposed in some sense, or revealed, to the opposite, and now it's swung way in the other direction. And so,
could I just say one thing in the defense of the Neoplatonists, which is, if you read Erigena and Cusa, you get to and Erigena is clear on this. You get a dialectical in the Platonic sense, not the Hegelian sense, in which the emanation and the emergence completely interpenetrate. They're both needed, they interpenetrate each other. And I would argue that what's happening now people are moving, especially in the philosophy of biology, towards we need bottom up and top down. Jordan, this is rife through all of cognitive psychology, bottom up, top down thinking, right? And that's not just specific to the mind. I think it's now spreading out as, no, this is how we should start to think about it. But I think a more proper reading, especially of the later Neoplatonists, points to that heritage within Neoplatonism itself. So it doesn't have to be something necessarily foreign to Christianity, I would at least argue.
No, St. Maximus is clearly a bottom up and top down at the same time. In St. Maximus's cosmology, you have the notion that these revelations are both a communion of love and also a revelation from above, and that there's absolutely no contradiction between the elements coming together and coagulating in this relationship of love, and it expressing this divine principle or this higher principle which is coming down from above. And in terms